Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Carl Fay, and I'm the host of today's event. Together with my colleague Stephanie Wong, I run what is called the Academy of International Business Journals webinar series, which seeks to popularize recent publications in the Journal of International Business Studies and the Journal of International Business Policy. Today, we're lucky to have a very special session which is focusing on JIBS editors' views on the future of international business. This is the result of a special collection the current editor-in-chief of JIBS, Rosalie Tung, has put together with herself and four other previous editors of JIBS. And so we're really lucky to have such esteemed scholars with us today to discuss their editorials about what they think about the future of international business. Next slide, please. This is the list of the editorials and their titles. And I would like to mention that unfortunately, due to travel, Paul Beamish is not able to be with us today, but he has written also an excellent editorial that I strongly encourage you to read. Shortly after I finish talking, I will put in the chat a link to where you can find this collection, and hope that you'll have a chance to read all of these if you have not already. Today, as our world is facing increasing geopolitical tensions, becoming increasingly multipolar, having the advent of AI, more wars, a lot of talk of tariffs and many other things, it's probably an appropriate time for us to reflect about what exactly the future of international business is. Thus, this webinar is hopefully useful for everyone. The way we're going to proceed today is following my brief introduction. We're going to have each of the former and current editors of JIBS to take briefly 7 minutes to present their thoughts from their editorial. Then I will take one or two questions. And so I would encourage you to write in the chat the questions that you have, and I will choose one or two of those to ask at the end of that. And once this is done, we will then have a panel discussion where we'll talk about some current themes in international business. Following that, at the end, there will be a chance for a few people to ask some questions as well. And so please be thinking about your questions and writing them in the chat as you would like to. We will be able to share the PowerPoints that some of the presenters are using today following the webinar, and those will be available at the AIB webinar page, and I will send in the chat the link to that shortly. So with this, I would like to welcome you again to the seminar and to welcome very much and thank them for making time in their busy schedule, the current and previous editors-in-chief of JIBS, Rosalie Tung, Alain Verbeke, Lorraine Eden, Arie Lewin. Thank you very much all for joining us. Without then further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Rosalie Tung. And Rosalie is the chaired professor of international business at Simon Fraser University and has served from 2017 to 2020 as Dean of the Fellows of the Academy of International Business, and from 2015 to 2016 as the president of the Academy of International Business, as well as from 2003 to 2004, the president of Academy of Management. And she's currently, of course, the editor-in-chief of JIBS. She's also an elected fellow of the Academy of Management, the Academy of International Business, the British Academy of Management, and a number of other organizations. And she received the John Dunning Award from the Academy of International Business, as well as many other awards. So Rosalie, thanks for joining us. I will turn over to you now to explain a little bit how this collection evolved and to share a bit about your editorial.
Well, thank you very much, Carl. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. The collection of editorials is an outgrowth of a webinar that was organized by Charles Generash and Leanne Liu in 2024 to celebrate the legacy of Bill Ogrim. Bill Ogrim, of course, is the first editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Business Studies. As Carl mentioned, there are, we live in challenging and interesting times. So within the confines of the 7 minutes that I have, I'll focus on the two developments that I've highlighted in my editorial. these two developments are, one is the rise of the global south, and the second development is the retrenchment from hyperglobalization and global mindset. So I'll briefly talk about each of these. With regard to the rise of the global south, the bulk of theories and principles that are used in international business were developed in the Western world, and by and large, these are positives, as the Western-based scientific approach to scholarship has provided solid foundations for the generation of reliable and credible knowledge. Also, international agencies such as the World Bank, IMF, all of these have also provided a solid foundation for the pursuit of economic growth. However, with the rise of the global south, there is increasing concern on their part that the rules of the games were dictated by or set by the global north, and hence their aspirations and the new realities are not truly captured. So it is in this context that there should be a greater inclusion of the global south, and by global south, I don't mean just looking at China or India, but really countries within the global south itself. It's interesting. It would be useful to look at the dynamics and processes that take place in the global south countries, their approach to internationalization, and the multinational enterprises that may emanate from these areas itself. Cal talked about the move from the bipolar to the multipolar world. And so therefore, in an editorial that I recently co-wrote with Yadong Luo on the multipolar geostrategy, we talked about how the singular or unified global strategy that was popularized by Bartlett and Goschel, Gemma-Watt, Yip, and others, while they were very useful to understanding IB phenomena in the past, but because of the changes, we may need to re-examine these. And I think there's plenty of room for new theory development in the area of multipolar geostrategy itself. The second development that I briefly like to highlight is the retrenchment from hyperglobalization and global mindset. So if we take the example of expatriate assignments, an unstated assumption is that a global mindset is valued by both firms and people. However, with the current geopolitical situation, we see that there are many constraints to the development of this global mindset. I'll use some of the metrics that are commonly used to gauge commitment to foster a global mindset, such as the level of student exchange, inward and outward investment in each other's countries, extent of collaborative research, and frequency of direct flights between major cities in China and the United States. And we see that all of these metrics have actually been going down. So what are the implications of this retreat from hyperglobalization and global mindset? First is that there needs to be greater reattention to focus on nationalism, how nationalism can affect barriers and restrictions to trade. There is also a greater need to look at non-market forces in the global economy. Nationalism or nativism can also give rise to populist sentiments, which can in turn contribute to political risk or instability in a country. Greater polarization of groups within and across countries can also intensify or contribute to intergroup conflicts. And I think it is important to look at these kinds of issues as to how they affect trade, immigration, financial shocks, and so on and so forth are concerned. The multipolar world also puts a new spin on the concept of foreign, liability of foreignness, which has been widely used in our literature, and plays greater attention to the liability of origin. Increasingly, we see that the country of origin of the MNE in and of itself could be a liability. So collectively, these developments mean that we need to revisit the literature on immigration, expatriate assignments, and intergroup relations. I would like to conclude by saying that under conditions of relative stability, which was what we had been operating under for the past 2 to 3 decades, there was less of a need for a paradigm shift. But with VUCA conditions, coupled with the two developments that I talked about, I think it is important for us to rethink the theories and concepts that we have been so used to in the IB literature itself, through the inclusion of new topics, injection of novel theories to generate additional insights and perspectives. Thank you very much, Colin.
Thank you very much, Rosalie, for getting us off to a very nice start. If anyone has some questions, perhaps you can type them in the chat so that I can ask them to Rosalie. Well, we don't have any questions yet, but please feel free to type them in for Rosalie in any case as we move on. But in the interest of time, let's move on to our second presentation now, which is going to be by Alain Verbeke. Alain is, of course, a professor at the University of Calgary, and he, sorry, one second. And he is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He has served 2 terms as editor-in-chief of JIBS, and it's noteworthy that in that time period, the citations of JIBS doubled. Professor Verbeke's main contributions to the field of international business strategy include making critical distinction between location-bound and non-location-bound firm-specific advantages of the multinational enterprise, the subsidiary-specific advantage concept, bounded rationality, the concept of bifurcation bias in family firms, and substantial work on demonstrating the dominance of regional over global strategies, something very appropriate in our changing world today. Alain is also an elected fellow of the Academy of International Business as well as AIB. So without further ado, let's turn over to Alain to hear about the value theory and evidence-based intellectual dialogue on foundational elements of the ideal field. Alain?
Good day, everyone. Thank you, Carl, for organizing this webinar. Yes, it's a pleasure to say a few words about the kind of the essence of the 2025 editorial. So perhaps first a few points about basics. When I became editor-in-chief in 2017, I felt that there was a need for a formal intellectual dialogue in the IB field. Of course, there had been a lot of informal dialogue, especially at the large conferences such as the AIB. But of course, even if you have an epic discussion at a conference, there is nothing that lasts. And so I think it was important to actually have that formal dialogue in the form of point-counterpoint discussions. And I think that that is even more important in 2025 than in 2017, because I think that increasingly we see actually opinions in the literature on what multinational enterprises should do and should not do. My second point related to this is that if we really are serious about cumulative knowledge development in IB, then we really need to have this formal confrontation of sometimes contradictory pieces of empirical evidence. And it's only if we do that that we can actually then, distinguish between what I would call romanticized opinion and then actually the evidence-based description of what multinational firms do. As a last point here is about the distinct value of IB. We're the only people really who focus on the multinational enterprise. We are the only field that has theories of the multinational enterprise, which is the most complex class of business organization, and really is very much in line with the Reading School view of this. The theory of the multinational enterprise is really the most comprehensive general theory of the firm. We, of course, have many challenges, internal and external challenges. I don't want to go into any depth here, but Cassen and Lai focused on this or observed that there is a lot of siloing in the field of international business. Now, my perspective is that actually specialization is unavoidable, but I think it should be based always on a solid foundation of understanding the M&E. That is unfortunately not always there when we look at published work. Many of us older scholars will remember kind of what Hambrick and Chen said in AMR, that is then more the external challenge. They said that actually, yeah, IB served its purpose. It helped to internationalize business schools. Thank you very much, but we don't need you anymore. My perspective is that it's unproductive to dismiss what you do not study or understand. As a final point, there was a recent piece in Barney that also highlights, I think, the need for dialogue. So Barney and his co-authors said, well, there are really two main theories of the M&E. There is everything that has to do with transaction cost theories to solve transactional problems. And then there are really the resources and capabilities theories. That's about value creation. I think that that piece fundamentally misunderstands existing international business theory. And that's my opinion. And I certainly think that it deserves active debate. Let me then quickly say a few things about the specific dialogues, point counterpoints that I talk about in the editorial. First is the whole issue of intellectual property rights in China, the non-protection thereof. And so there is really these two views, right? On the one hand, that China is the emerging economy. It will become more responsible over time in terms of IPR protection, versus the other view that China is an opportunistic national system that seeks technological dominance and will, whenever it can, take advantage of a global governance trading system with weak enforcement. Now, irrespective of which version is true, there is probably some truthfulness to each. I think that this debate remains important in 2025. And I think when we talk about country-level decoupling, we have to talk about IPR protection. I also think, for example, that this is very important in the context of AI-related companies and internationally operating firms. You think, for example, about DeepSeek, that on the surface came out of the blue. But as some observers have said, there appears to have been a lot of the new word, exfiltration of data from the Microsoft labs in China using the OpenAI interface to make this possible. So lots of work for us in the future. A second debate that I discuss here in the editorial is that internationalization may not what it seems to be on the surface. So we all know the Johansen and Valne classic work and its many iterations after the original paper. But basically, there were a number of counterpoints published in JIBS. And one of the counterpoints basically said, well, even using the very data of Johansen and Valne, there is a very different conclusion that arises from there than the idea that there is incremental learning and that actually operating modes become increasingly complex over time. The new view was that, based on these original data, was that actually multinational enterprises make multiple bets in Penrosian waves to engage with many entrepreneurial opportunities at the same time. Multinationals use their extant FSAs to do this and to reduce risks, very much consistent with what I call new internalization theory. So the conclusion of that is that risk diversification is actually international entrepreneurship, which is very kind of a very different view of looking at risk diversification than we find in the conventional literature. But the conclusion that is more general is that we should not only try to contextualize classic studies in terms of the time in which they were written, in terms of the countries where the phenomenon occurred. I think we need to review the empirical results themselves. But as one of my recent PhD students said, after looking at existing replication studies in IB, there have been only 18 so far. And that is a little bit worrying if we want cumulative knowledge development. Then finally, a kind of another dialogue that I dwell on is the whole issue of cooperation between large established multinational enterprises and smaller host country players. And so the authors of the point that was published in JIBS said, what really matters is strategic intent. And nowadays, we also hear a lot about strategic purpose. The question, of course, is, does intent really matter? The point says, yeah, it matters a lot. In fact, everything is based on intent and purpose. But the counterpoint basically says, well, no, actually there is an underlying economic rationale. There are economic fundamentals that are much more important than intent. And so the conclusion that I drew from that particular dialogue is that when you think about these international collaborative agreements, well, they always require resource bundling between parties. So there are resource characteristics, there are human frailties, and those must be considered first before we talk about actually strategic intent or strategic purpose of the partners. So the more general point is, and then we'll stop here, is that when we think in terms of future IB research, we always should think about what is the proper hierarchy of research questions to ask. And I think that in 2025, we see more and more scholars looking at secondary questions rather than at the primary questions. And it's not that the secondary questions are unimportant, but you can only adequately address the secondary questions if you have actually first talked about the primary ones. So I will just stop here, but I may come back to these themes as we answer some of the questions that will undoubtedly arise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alain, for a very interesting presentation. If you have a question for Alain, please write that in the chat. But in the meantime, we do have a question for Rosalie. So Rosalie, you've been asked, how does the rising nationalism in India specifically and the global South more broadly affect the survival of foreign multinational enterprises? Is it a threat for foreign M&Es and an opportunity for local firms to increase domestic market share? Would you like to respond to that briefly, Rosalie?
Obviously, it would take a lot more time to answer the question. I think it presents both opportunities and challenges, and I'd like to, see more of this in terms of, the formulation of, questions, that are, based on the existing literature, but also, like drawing in new concepts and constructs, to analyze this phenomenal situation that we see.
Okay, thanks, Rosalie. Alain, we have one question for you as well from Ans, who's wanting to know what are the primary questions according to you?
Okay, that's a very...
I'm sure you can get that in 30 seconds, right?
Yeah, that's a very deep question. I think the first important point is where can we provide intellectual value added as international business scholars? In other words, there are many grand challenges, and there are many opinions on grand challenges, and we'll discuss some of these. But the question is always, where is international business scholarship really well positioned to answer very particular specific questions? So the specific questions, in my view, always revolve around the multinational enterprise that is basically forced to reconfigure resources when it extends internationally. So in other words, when we do business internationally, there are almost no pure repeatability plays. We always have to reconfigure resources. So the first question that we always have to answer when we basically try to engage with a productive opportunity abroad, what are the needs for resource reconfiguration that will, of course, automatically require enlisting the resources that come from foreign actors. So it's always about resource bundling. It's always about the specific nature of the resources of the two parties that then lead to a governance system, and that then ultimately leads to value creation and value distribution. But one more point about this, I think I know where Anne's question comes from. Her question is probably guided by the idea of increasingly stakeholders and right holders expecting the multinational enterprise to exercise corporate social responsibility, both in the greening space and in the space of social justice. So I think that these are very important elements to consider. But again, I think that when you talk about greening and when you think about social justice, there must be the primary question answered. Is there, to start with, an economic economic value-driven opportunity, to which we can then add greening, to which we can then add social justice, but to expect multinational enterprise to basically be the flag carriers of greening or to be the flag carriers of social justice, I think that that is a very big error that unfortunately some scholars are making. The multinational enterprise is ultimately a tool, yes, to overcome market imperfections, to create and distribute value. But again, both greening and social justice are to a large extent, not exclusively, but are to a large extent goals that are positioned in the distributional sphere. And the distributional sphere only makes sense if actually there is that value creating opportunity that you engage with in the first place. So I think that we need to do a better job at integrating these demands from stakeholders with actually what the multinational enterprise is meant to do. And we should not have unrealistic expectation. The multinational enterprise, even the largest supposedly global firm, are very vulnerable creatures. And I think that society sometimes has exaggerated expectations. And again, let's distinguish between the romanticized storylines and actually evidence-based narratives on what multinationals actually can do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alain. There are a couple other questions, but I think in the interest of time, we will move on. Some people were wondering a little bit about actually the hierarchy of questions that you had. If you could explain a little bit about that. Either you can maybe type something briefly in the chat, or perhaps we can follow up a little bit later. And also, some people were not totally clear what the primary questions were. Keep answering your questions, and asking your questions rather, and we'll come back to some of these in our panel discussion. But now I would like to thank Alain and move on to our next panelist, who is Lorraine Eden. And Lorraine was the editor-in-chief of JIBS from 2008 to 2010. And from 2017 to 2018, she was the president of AIB. And from 2020 to 2023, she was the dean of the fellows. She also received the inaugural Women of AIB Woman of the Year Award, and received the JIBS 50th Anniversary Gold Medal for her service. And she is a professor emeritus at Texas A&M. In addition, she is an expert in transfer pricing, which is the pricing of transactions and allocation of profits inside M&E groups. And also expert on strategies, structures, and societal impacts of M&Es. She has been ranked among the top 2% of the world's most cited research scientists. And quite interesting, she also has developed a transfer pricing program that's actually trained hundreds of people at Texas A&M. So Lorraine, thank you so much for making time to be with us today. And to talk about a very interesting paper, very provocative title you have here, Exit, Pursuit by a Bear, Global Shocks, and M&E Responses. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Lorraine, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. And I'm delighted to be here today and have an opportunity to speak to so many members of AIB about some of the work that I've been doing with many co-authors. When the original proposal for this was set up by Charles Donaraj, the idea was that we would talk about where we thought an area of international business was thin and could be expanded. And I'd been working for some time with a group of faculty looking at wars and forms of violent conflict, and more generally on crises, event studies, and various methods associated with that. And I thought maybe I could encourage some people to work more in this area if I talked about how that work had evolved and where we were going. So I call this Exit Pursued by Bear because that's exactly what was happening here. We have a crisis event with the bear coming across the stage. This was from a Shakespeare play. So let me just dive right in here. And first of all, I think it's important to understand the framework of the way that I've been thinking about problems in international business for the last few years. And I think about them in terms of, or the things I've been interested in studying, in effect, are events, bounded observable actions that may have started inside or outside a system. And I've been interested in what I want to call event analysis, the study of research questions that involve events. If you think of a shock is an event. It's a non-routine disruptive event. And global shocks are non-routine disruptive events that actually happen in at least two continents. So if you want to study shock events, what I realize is you actually may need special methods, you may need special data sets, and decision-making by the actors may be quite different because often it happens under a high uncertainty with short time for decision-making. So let me talk to you then about certain types of shock events. And this is work actually that my husband, Chuck Herman, did earlier in his career. And these were discussions over lunchtime tables as we talked through my interest in events and his own history of working in events. He's a political scientist. And Chuck had worked early on something that he called the crisis cube, which is the thinking of particular types of events that are crisis situations. Now, what I want to mean here is, in his model, there are three situational characteristics that are important when you think about an event from an actor's perspective. An actor, first of all, is how aware is the actor of this shock event that's happening? Did they know that it was coming? Was it a complete surprise to them? Second is, what's the likely impact going to be on them? It could be positive or negative. It could be short run and long run. It could be high or low. But talk about the expected impact of that event on the actor. And then the last thing is, given what's happened, whether it was a complete surprise or not a surprise, and the expected acts you had, what is the actor going to do? What decisions is the actor or the team of actors going to do about that? And do they have to make decisions very quickly, or do they have lots of time to do it? And Chuck defined a crisis as an unanticipated, in other words, a surprise event that had high impact shocks, positive or negative, and basically the decision makers had very little time. So they're making decisions under a situation of high uncertainty where they really don't understand what they're doing, and they're likely going to be all kinds of pathologies involved in this. Now, I then had been working already on violent conflict events, started originally with Lee Dye, who was a PhD student of mine, and Lee and Paul Beamish and I have a series of papers that basically look at war zones and look at how multinational subsidiaries in host countries in war zones react to the war. And we look at both the announcement and the breakout of the war, and then what happens if the wars are ongoing and repeated wars. In terms of the framework we used was thinking about whether the firm would stay or leave, whether it would go early or go late, or would it go whole or in part. And so some of you may have read some of these questions. I subsequently worked with Kathy Liu and Dan Lee and Marjorie Lyles on some work coming out of Kathy's dissertation, which was written under Dan Lee, on terrorist events. So now I'm studying two forms of violent conflict. One, wars, and the second one, terrorist attacks, and they're not the same. They are events, and there can be global shock events. And then the question is, how do you respond to them? And there is a literature on this, but it's not very big. And one of the reasons why I wrote this piece was to try and encourage more people to do more work in the area. The framework used in all of the ones I've been involved with have been vulnerability theory, and I'll speak about that in a minute. But Jennifer Oetzel, as you probably know too, has done a lot of work using stakeholder theory. And then Kathy's stuff actually looked at it from perceptions, from the multinationals' perception, more of a behavioral theory of the firm. I'm going to talk you through thinking about a framework for doing research on shock events. And I want you, as I'm talking about this, I'm going to talk about violent conflict, but I want you to think Trump tariffs. I want you to think about how you would apply this framework to understanding what's going on right now, since January the 20th, with the types of tariffs and other events that we're seeing. In the vulnerability theory, on the left is a shock. Then there's an effective box trying to predict how vulnerable the actor is to the shock, right? What the actor does, that's its responses, and then what the outcomes are of that. So in the editorial, I propose several steps that IB scholars could use this framework. First of all is unbundling that shock. You need to, in the context of a violent conflict, you need to understand the characteristics of the conflict, and you have to recognize that a war is not the same as a terrorist attack or an armed insurrection or a political coup. They have different characteristics, and they are going to matter here. And I would argue the same. We talk about tariffs as a shock event. You've got to understand the types of tariffs. The second is to look at the vulnerability of the multinational here, and that's its at-risk resources, how exposed it is to it, and what its resilience or coping mechanisms are. And in the PowerPoint, I go through these a little bit more in terms of how one would unbundle these. Then the question is, if you put the shock event together or the crisis event together with the vulnerable understanding of how vulnerable the multinational feels to that crisis or shock, you then can make some predictions about the responses are. They can be market-based responses. They can be non-market-based responses. Those non-market-based ones can be socially responsible, like engagement in CSR, for example, or building legitimacy. But they can be socially irresponsible ones, too, about engaging in bribery and corruption, dark markets, for example. Step 4 is to predict the outcomes. And then, of course, we're home here. You could look at this from the impacts on the multinational in terms of firm performance, as the strategy faculty do. You could look at the impacts on global value chains and on industries. You then could also scale up and look at the macro impacts and the societal impacts of the strategies. And then the last piece, I think, and I think this is very important here, is to think about the contextual and confounding factors. And here I want to talk particularly about the fact that the characteristics of multinational are going to vary, the type of shock is going to vary, that there's a clear difference between perceived and actual vulnerability that shows up in Kathy Liu's work on here, on this. Home and host country institutions like rule of law will matter also. And then lastly, because we're looking at complex VUCA systems, you need to take account of hysteresis, virtual circles and vicious circles, nonlinearity problems. What I'm suggesting is this overall sort of framework can handle, I think, dozens of papers that differentiate in terms of what they pick as the dependent variable versus the independent variables, whether they zone in at the level of the M&E executive or they scale out to talk about the impacts on societal welfare. Databases and methods are going to be different too. Particularly if you're using conflict, there's only certain numbers of conflict databases, and the methods have to be event-based. So traditionally, for example, in political science, the methods would be qualitative case studies. But there's lots of time to event models, survival analysis, event history, rare event methods that can be used here. In the PowerPoints, I have a dozen papers on this now. And I know that I think there's the opportunity for IB scholars to do lots more event-centered work using this vulnerability framework to think about how firms respond and what the outcomes are on here. So let me just finish up by saying what we have here in Shakespeare's Winter's Tale. He has the bear coming across the stage, and he chases Antigonus across the stage, and unfortunately, Antigonus dies at the end of here. I'm hoping that my little presentation might be actually a way to encourage you to thinking about how to take this analogy and really make it into some papers of your own. So thank you very much. And if I can figure out how to turn the stop the share, there it is. I can stop the share, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorraine, for a very interesting presentation. We have a number of general questions, but I don't think you had a specific question for you. So I think we'll move on to our next presentation and final presentation, and then cover some of these questions in our discussion. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce Arie Lewin, Arie is a professor emeritus of strategy and international business at Duke University and a distinguished visiting professor at a number of business schools in China, including Fudan, Shanghai Jiao Tong, and Zhejiang University. Professor Lewin is one of the people who has the broadest experience serving as an editor of most recently Management and Organization Review, then previously Journal of International Business Studies, and initially as the founding editor of Organizational Science, a journal he led from start through a rapid growth to be a quite well-established journal. Professor Lewin's research and consulting focus on organizational adaptation and change, historical economic progression, and the coevolution of innovation, and how China has emerged as an innovation economy. He was the 2012 AIB John Dunning Award winner, among many other awards that he's won, such as the 2003 Academy of Management Distinguished Service Award and the 1986 Duke University President's Distinguished Service Award. I think Arie probably won't object if I share with you that he is one of the more innovative academics I know, despite recently having celebrated his 90th birthday. So we're really honored and inspired by Arie's intellect. And thank you, Arie, so much for being with us today to share your thoughts on looking ahead for developments that could affect the field of international business. Arie, over to you. Please do try to keep your comments to 7 minutes, as we've been asking everyone to do.
I think Lorraine spoke more than 7 minutes, but that's the second point. It is my pleasure, my duty, my honor to be part of this webinar. My thinking about what to do today went through many phases. So, and I'm sorry to say that I cannot share with you the PowerPoint deck that I have, but there must be some mechanism by which I can later on share it with you. To frame it a little bit, I'd like to sort of remind you that if you look at global trade before the year 2000, China is an absolute non-participant. Global trade before 2000 was dominated by the United States. By 2020, China dominates global trade. The United States is like at the bottom of the list in terms of trading with other countries. So I asked myself, how did this happen? And just to give you a quick history, pre-2000, President Clinton was a strong advocate to allow China to join the WTO. Other aggressive advocates were theoretical international trade economists led by Paul Krugman, the American Chamber of Commerce, of course, corporate America. But what's interesting, if you go back and study the newspapers and the commentaries of the time, the wide belief was that if China joined the WTO, they would also adopt the rules and comply by the rules of the WTO. Which, as it turned out, the Chinese had no intention to dominate. One of the things that I learned when I was a distinguished professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing, that university was a center where for over 4 years, they prepared China for entering the WTO. What does it mean, prepare China to enter the WTO? It meant that they knew every rule, every procedure to appeal, every excuse for violating rules, how to postpone violation of rules. In fact, the United States did its best to have China toe the line, but they never did. And at the end, the United States took the ultimate step of not nominating individuals to the appeals court of the WTO. And so there was no way to ever resolve any disagreements among members of the WTO. And if you examine the looked at the newspapers, the news of the time, there was no discussion at all about any risks that could be associated with China joining the WTO. And then what happens, COVID basically revealed the vulnerability of supply chains. It has nothing to do yet with the conflict between China and the United States or whatever. It's just that COVID suddenly basically highlighted the fragility of supply chains, and basically for the first few years there was a race. We call it the ABC race. Locate anywhere but China, anywhere but China. We have an idea of what companies were doing. That was followed much later by the discovery that there was a big effect on the loss of manufacturing jobs, but it was not quantified. Basically, it was not easily recognized because the loss occurs at the local community level, where there might be a factory that is very important for the economics of that community. In North Carolina, in a matter of few years, we lost the furniture manufacturing industry, but it's dispersed across several counties, and the trickle of how many people got laid off and so forth was not an organized way to get the data. Robert Reich, who worked for Clinton, understood that this problem was going on, but he describes the hardship of trying to get hard data about what is going on and what is the effect. Roddy, his 1997 book, Has Globalization Gone Too Far, really provides the first careful analysis that something is not working, that communities are suffering, they lost economic basis, but he also did not have hard data. It turned out that one of our fellows, Elizabeth Rose, published a paper in the journal called Management Organization Review, of which I was the editor at the time, and she showed that the reason the data was not obvious is because in the databases that being maintained, employment in manufacturing was combined with employment with the ICT industry and the computer industry. And so if you look at that data, you could write the paper that Farouk Contractor wrote that the loss of manufacturing jobs was fake news. But the truth is that it was very severe. Paul Rugman, published his Mea Culpa at a very big meeting at the public school in Michigan on October 2009. This long speech is available online. You can read it yourself. But somewhere in this speech it says, I'm a theoretical economist. I don't do empirical work, so I did not bother to try and find out what possibly could be any empirical thing going on. The actual loss of jobs is 20% of manufacturing jobs at the end of 2000 have been lost. So that basically lays out the ground that part of the problem that we're facing today, it has its origin in decisions that were taken many years ago by President Clinton, by the economists who provided them theoretical support, by the American Chamber of Commerce, and by corporate America, which just was dying to get into China and exploit the domestic market, and most importantly, build supply chains which are much lower cost, allow them to close factories in the United States and import components and finished products at much lower cost, and therefore increase the profitability, etc. So this migration of jobs turned out to be very serious.
You have about 2 minutes left if possible.
I'm sorry, Carl, what did you say?
If possible, try to wrap up in about 2 minutes or so.
Okay, well, let me just tell you where this is going. I will not go into detail, but in 2023, the Australian Strategy Policy Sciences Institute documented that China has emerged as China, an authoritarian regime, emerged, basically leapfrogged the United States in 37 fields of science and technology. And people that I work with, at least we recognize that China is now an innovation economy, and I don't have the time to take you through how they did that. What we do know that now it is becomes a serious problem. Our national debt goes up. We've not been able to sell enough to balance the budgets, and and in fact, we could not continue much longer with allowing the national debt to increase before the U.S. reserve currency status would be in danger. At the same time, under President Biden, and you know, I have a colleague, Ronnie Chatterjee, who spent 2 years at the White House. They came up with the what Rosalie and colleagues called the technological Cold War. They came up with the explanation for why President Biden issued the CHIPS Act and the Science Act as a defensive strategy to hold China back. So that gives some idea of the beginning of the technological Cold War. Where did all of this go? Well, it brings up the fact that we're observing a movement toward the polar world because other autocratic countries are joining trading blocs. And in the paper that I've worked with Michael Witt, we talked about the fact that we can anticipate the emergence of quite a number of trading blocs, and that trading blocs are going to be the place where the negotiations will take place about reforming the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, etc. And this is a huge research issue for people in IB, because most likely, as Noah Smith has recently written about, it's opening the century of China when the century of the United States is slipping away. So I would say that this small introduction lays out quite a number of issues that have to do for IB and multinational corporations, both in terms of what can you reshore, why you cannot reshore, the much more complicated supply chains spread around the world, and how do you manage those. But the worst part is that it also puts, as President Trump is trying to do, I'm not defending what he's doing by any means, because he's a little bit of a crazy man, but the issues that he's trying to deal with built up over a long time. It's not like they were just suddenly sprung upon us. And they are very difficult from a US point of view in terms of what kind of manufacturing can we bring back, what kind of new industry can we start that will replace the industries that have been lost, what other arrangements are we going to have to deal with that allows us to influence the shape of the new order of global trade, given that autocracies now, there are more countries that are autocracies than there are liberal democracies. And let me end up by saying that, you know, when I'm in China, they often tell me, well, what about the crisis of capitalism? I mean, capitalism is not working that well. And it's true, there is the crisis of capitalism, the horrendous inequality that has emerged over the years is a huge problem for us. And so while we are all countries are facing the artificial intelligence revolution, which is like the fourth industrial revolution, liberal democracies also have to deal with the problem of the crisis of capitalism. So in a way, our hands are being tied behind our back as we're working on it. And the implications for multinational corporations are enormous. I'll just mention one small thing. You remember that I was running the largest offshoring project, about a 7-year period. And I got to know a lot of companies, eventually only in financial services, but in the beginning across industries, like Procter & Gamble. I was amazed to start receiving calls for some of these companies that participated in the study for advisory services on what should they thinking about when they're thinking about the potential shape of the outcome of trading blocks defining the new order of global trade. All of these are big topics should be big topics in IB. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Really interesting to hear about the evolution of China and how many things that are affecting IB are evolving. In fact, this is a perfect segue into our panel discussion. And of course, if anyone has been half awake over the last couple months, you have heard about tariffs. And so we have to start by talking about the tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed and the reciprocal tariffs that China and others have imposed. What does IB have to say about these tariffs? Are they a good thing? Can they be a good thing in some way? Do we need to adjust IB theory when we get over 100% tariffs? Lorraine, you've done quite some thinking around tariffs, so why don't we start with you?
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Yes, I'm reminded of the old movie Back to the Future, right? Or here's another one. They're back. Tariffs are back, right? When I wrote my PhD dissertation many, many years ago, and I'm not going to say the year, I wrote about multinationals and transfer pricing with tariffs. One of my first couple of publications were looking at transfer pricing when tariffs were in place and looking at the manipulation of prices. I spent a lot of time over my career studying the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and the NAFTA and tariffs coming down. I wrote about the WTO and the integration of economies. And basically, as we all know, tariffs in the developed world have been close to zero for a long time. Now, that doesn't mean they were zero on all products. You probably don't remember that the United States had a trade war with the European Union, in particular with Germany and France over cars. It was called the chicken tax in 1964. All right, so that's a long time ago. The chicken tax ended up with a 25% tariff on trucks. Light trucks. That tariff put in 1964 is still in place in the United States. So one of the things I've done over the last couple of days, because I've been asked to speak quite a lot on tariffs in the last couple of weeks, is look at that chicken tariff and the impacts that has had, which I think have been really quite fascinating. Anyway, the things we understand about tariffs, I'm one of the people who, when Trump first put on his tariffs, I was one of that large group of economists that signed up and said, this is nuts. That all the economists, at least all the economists that I'm aware of, believe that putting on high tariffs has negative impacts on welfare. But what we're seeing now, I think, personally, from an international business research perspective, there are some things I think that are different now. And Arie alluded to one of them. The global value chains are far more integrated than when I was first studying tariffs way back when. And they are going to disrupt those global supply chains enormously, and particularly the things that come from China. Many active pharmaceutical ingredients, for example, that the U.S. imports come straight from China. They will be tariffed out. We can talk.
Try to wrap up in about a minute so we can
yes.
get a good discussion.
And then, well, let me say, I think that we're in a different situation. Because of the integration, we will pull back, like Arie said, to more regional blocks. I think U.S.-China could potentially be a major chicken war of its own, the game of chicken, tit-for-tat retaliation with significant negative impacts. And yes, I do think I'm responding to Ruth Aguilar's question in the chat, which is, yes, Ruth, I think IB has stuff to say about this, all the way from internalization theory to liability of foreignness, and maybe we can come back to talk about that.
Thanks very much. I think we'll all be remembering about the chicken tariffs after today. Can we go next to Alain, and then we'll come to Arie?
So I think that one of the problems talking about tariffs right now is that everybody I talk to who is advising or not advising, some of them are advisors directly to the White House, they don't think that this is permanent. This is a conversation. This is a bit of a process of trying to get to a point where some agreements will come. For example, the EU and the US are putting tariffs on electric vehicles from China. Why? Because, just to give a plug to my book on the electric vehicle industry, it's coming out in Cambridge University Press. In this book, we show that the German and US managers considered Tesla a curiosity. Many times they said Tesla is a curiosity, which means they did not have to change their strategies. And now that they missed the opportunity to be in electric vehicles, the same liberal democracies are imposing defensive strategies, industrial policies, defensive strategies to protect these industries, the internal combustion engine industries, which are basically going to be obsolete. But how did China build this industry from nothing? It is the largest producer of cars. We allowed that to happen. What can we say about the field of strategy in international business, about companies who allowed this to happen to them? It's a fascinating story. The local Western companies in China, the managers in China did not inform headquarters of what is going on in electric vehicles in China. So one set of tariffs, we say, oh, these are defensive tariffs. We have to do it because we have to protect these industries. So we don't know at all yet how this, I don't know what Lorraine calls it. It's a great title, but this game of chicken or whatever you call it, the tit for tat is going on, partly is for that reason. Partly it's for reasons that I don't even understand. We actually have huge oil reserves that Biden did not allow to be exploited any further or to even be started. Yet this is one resource that if we had enough of it, we could guarantee to the EU, and it would solve a big aspect of the negative trade deficit. But anyway, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's fantastic to be in the field of IB right now.
Thanks very much, Arie, for sharing that. Can I ask that everyone tries to keep their comments to about 2 minutes so we have a more flowing discussion? And Alain, can I turn over to you next? And I'd actually like to ask a specific thing that has not been answered yet from my question so much, and that is, does IB theory, explain what's going on, or do we need adaptation? Maybe you can comment about that relating to trade and tariffs.
Well, you raise exactly the right question. We all have opinions on tariffs, but the question is, as IB scholars, what can we bring that cannot be brought by political scientists, international economists, etc.? And let me just make 3 points. So in 1988, I worked at University of Toronto with the late Alan Rugman, and most Canadian scholars from political science, many economists, they were opposed to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. They said it was going to destroy the Canadian economy, that most US multinationals would retreat to the United States and then serve the Canadian market out of large-scale efficient plants. But all of this was false, basically, driven by emotion, ill-advised opinion. We actually knew better because Alan served on the Trade Advisory Committee that was advising the Prime Minister with lots of CEOs of big Canadian multinationals. And we were also in touch with the CEOs of the largest subsidiaries of US multinationals. So the reality is that nobody was thinking about leaving Canada. They were only thinking about how to reconfigure resources in the face of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. So in other words, it's always about, what does, in this case, a tariff, what does it eliminating a tariff, what does it mean in terms of changing the structure, the portfolio of country-specific advantages, and how does it affect firm-specific advantages of the affected companies? There is, of course, also, as a second point, a great tariff paradox that actually, in this era of global value chains, the firms that may be punished the hardest by tariffs may be the very firms that actually are supposed to be protected by the tariffs because they made decisions in the years and decades prior to offshore and to outsource. But the thing is that we always have to also think about the positive aspect of this, right? Multinationals are very resilient and they continuously reassess locations and they continuously reassess operating modes for their value chain. So we have to put it in perspective. I mean, let me give you one example here. On January 30th, 2012, the Canadian dollar was at par with the US dollar. At this moment, today, the Canadian dollar is worth 73 US cents. No one talks about this, but the depreciation of the Canadian dollar over 13 years is actually more significant than the magnitude of tariffs that we're talking about. So I think the difference is that tariffs are now a shiny object for many, and that actually currency depreciation is not. But in both cases, they're simply market imperfections imposed by government. And the field of IB is, I think, very well equipped to address those in terms of how MNEs will respond. And a last very quick point, our strength, again, is to study the resource reconfiguration by multinationals, not marginal effects on prices or on outputs. Other people should do that. Think of the Japanese automobile manufacturer Subaru. Right? It will now actually, because of the Canadian counter tax, not anymore export cars to Canada from the Indiana plant, but it will actually start importing cars into Canada out of the Japanese home base. So I think that we always have to think about, does the MNE need the specialized resources that are linked to a particular location? Are these complementary resources in particular locations, are they mobile? These are the questions that we are uniquely equipped to address as international business scholars and that no one else can address. So it's always about reconfiguration. Perhaps one last small point, much more important than tariffs has, of course, been COVID, as was mentioned. There was a standstill of the global economy. And I just ask you the question, how many of the Fortune 500 companies have gone bankrupt as a result of COVID? Probably close to not a single one. There has been an enormous reconfiguration of assets across borders. And indeed, there is probably a brilliant future for regional multinationals. But ultimately, this is what multinationals are meant to do, is to overcome and respond to market imperfections and basically engage in resource reconfiguration across borders. So I think that, again, tariffs are a shiny object, and we should think kind of about many other topics than tariffs, rather than basically focus too much on that shiny object. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alain. I want to ask one very brief follow-up question to you. You talked about reconfiguration of resources and that we're uniquely set to look at this. Some people I've talked to have said, why did Trump immediately say tariffs start today? Why didn't he say it starts in 6 months or it starts in 1 year or whatever? And of course, maybe people don't take it seriously or whatever. But what do you think about this? If you're going to move forward with tariffs, what does IB theory say? Was the shock that sort of do it immediately that Trump did the right way to do it, or should there have been a larger time frame?
Well, I think that if you want to achieve a particular goal, a public policy goal, it's probably better to have the longer time frame, because that allows actually firms to think more, to plan more about reconfiguration. But again, do we have much to say to a US policymaker about this as international business scholars? I think that we can leave that up to political scientists and some economists and some sociologists. I think, again, we have to think about this as a shock as there have been many in the recent past. And the question is, when there is then a sudden shock, how do you basically then respond as effectively as possible? But yes, I think that, for example, the Wall Street Journal has been very vocal about this. The Wall Street Journal, that is obviously very business friendly and multinational enterprise friendly, is that ultimately it would have been much wiser, especially if you want to then promote investment in the United States, to have basically a much longer transition period that would allow for negotiation. But basically, our value added is not to basically say how bad or how good the Trump approach is to tariffs. Our value added is basically, given that we're faced with this situation, how can multinationals now respond to this sudden shock? Just as many of us, I think, have written papers in terms of how multinational enterprises had to respond very, very quickly, immediately, when the COVID virus hit us. But again, I think that ultimately we speak about this far too much. I think that actually it's much better, rather than talking in general terms and what the White House thinks and what the Canadian Prime Minister thinks and what the EU is going to do. I think it's much better actually to talk to managers and to basically try to get from them what resource reconfigurations will occur in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan. We'll go quickly to Lorraine. Please try to stick just to 1 minute, Lorraine, and then we go to Rosalie to talk about divestment.
Hey, basically, what I wanted to say was we're focusing here on tariffs, which is clearly a trade tax. But what we really need to realize is in the background are coming a whole lot more changes in other things, in non-tariff barriers. Remember, tariffs fall on goods. The United States is a major exporter of services. It is the world's biggest exporter of intellectual property rights, right? Then you've got all the financial flows, and when we got digital. So what's happening, what I'm reading, is the first shock and awe that we've seen since January 20th has been focused on tariffs on goods, inputs all along the global value chain. But what's coming is a focus on national security issues, the use of Section 232 in the United States, for example, on national security to go after all kinds of industries. China itself is beefing up all those kinds of non-tariff barriers that apply to basically to services and to investments and to intellectual property. So I think what we have to realize is we are facing a movement back to a protectionist structure that Alain, I couldn't think of the name. You and Alain wrote years ago about how firms could use trade policies as a way to protect themselves, right? I also think we need to think now about liability of foreignness here and how you become insiders and outsiders and how you can use these. I think there's lots of room for work for IB scholars here, but we need to break away from just the work on tariffs. I think to note what's coming is, I think, a much bigger trade war that involves services, foreign direct investment, and intellectual property.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. Rosalie, let's move to the next question, where hopefully you can provide a little bit of insight for us. And that is, there's lots of IB work about foreign direct investment. Nowadays, some companies are starting to think about foreign direct divestment. What does IB theory have to say about this? Is this an opportunity? Do you have some thoughts on this subject you can share with us?
Sure. If I may comment a little bit on the points that both Lorraine and Alain raised. Okay, first is reconfiguration of resources. Obviously, is important, but I think it goes beyond the reconfiguration of resources alone. If you look at the editorial that Yadong and I co-wrote on multipolar geostrategy, we're talking about how IB theory that has informed us in the past several decades, which is based on continued globalization, those have to be revised in light of the constraints that are being imposed. So it goes beyond that. And I think it also addresses the national security issues. I agree with Lorraine and Alain, that tariffs are just as shiny objects. We see that Trump is, plans to impose tariffs on movies that are made outside of Hollywood, outside of the US itself. So that's a service. That's in the service sector itself. So I think that will have important implications for what we're going to look at in the future itself. With regard to divestment, I mean, obviously from the metrics that I cited just now, if we look at U.S. investment in China and Chinese investment in the United States, those have gone down. But in a different way, we're also seeing that investment has continued into China, not just from the United States, but from other countries as well. So I think it's erroneous to say, make a blanket assertion, that foreign investment in either countries have gone down. I think it's just, the way in which multinationals now have to disguise themselves in terms of its presence in another market. I mean, let's look at the case of TikTok. If we look at the issue of getting around tariffs, we see the backdoor approach, such as setting up plants in Vietnam and Mexico and so on and so forth. But obviously, divestment would be an important issue to look at, given the fact that it is taking place. And we have seen submissions recently in JIBS that looks at that particular phenomenon itself. So I think, while in the past the focus has always been on theories of foreign direct investment, I think, perhaps there should be conversely theories of foreign direct disinvestment or divestment.
Thanks very much, Rosalie. Very insightful comments. I'd now like to turn to Arie and ask a little bit about, the development of the multipolar world that we see that both you talked about, explaining really how this has happened, and Rosalie talked about as well. What does this actually say for IB theory? Does IB theory adequately, explain this? Or in what areas is the most adjustment needed? Arie, could you comment a little bit about this?
I'd like to comment on that also while I'm talking to Alain and Verbeke. It's very nice to talk about all these corporations, but we know in many ways, we know that if you're in the field of population ecology, their theory says that organizations are not able to adapt. It's only a matter of time when they get lost. David Teese gave a fantastic talk for the award, and David Teese's theory holds up for a very small fraction of companies. He never knows in advance how to go into a company and know whether it fits his model or not. So he finds a case of Samsung, great. But he doesn't have the underlying theory, let's say, that comes out of Oliver Williamson's dissertation, which basically provides a theory as to why organizations become inertia bound. If they become inertia bound, they're not able to adapt at the time that they need to adapt. And in IB, we don't have organization theorists actively participating in IB. Then I don't know any. I'm maybe the only one. And then you have geopolitics. Geopolitics is another area that suddenly becomes extremely important. And we don't know yet the direction that this can take, because the coalitions that are going to be formed will also come to agreements about tariffs, about protection of IPR. My prediction is, in the case of China, that any rewrite of the WTO will come up with very strict control over IPR, because they now produce more IPR than the rest of the world. So suddenly, that's going to be a big thing for them. And the control over IPR will be a very major element of restructuring the global border trade. So I think part of our problem is, and I'm it's not the matter of being critical, it's just the way things are. People are in IB, they think the world is IB. If I'm in management and organization theory, I think that's the foundation to thinking about international or any organization. And I can tell you that I used to take students to do small consulting jobs in Brazil, right? Like 15 of those each year. And then we would meet with the top management of the country, like from Procter & Gamble. We tell him, and we share with him what our findings is concerned. And then he goes on for half a day talking about his problems of getting approval from his regional headquarters, which is in Puerto Rico, just to change the color or a package of hair color. That tells me that this cannot be a very adaptive organization, because the bureaucracy that these large companies build gets very much in the way. And that's also in Oliver Williamson's PhD dissertation in 1981. So my thinking is that IB must find a way to suck in people in strategy and organization theory to take on IB as another dimension of their research, because they could contribute a lot in the way we frame the question, what we think it is, and so forth. Yes, I agree with Alain about large corporations should be able to survive longer because they have more assets and you can survive for a longer time. But basically, they're not better managed. There's only a handful of companies that are really fantastically managed, Microsoft being an example.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much for sharing your thoughts on that. Would anyone else like to comment on how IB's changing potentially due to the multipolar world? If not, perhaps I can ask a broader question that actually comes from the chat. Susan Schwartz asked this question, and she said, you know, some things one can maybe tweak a little bit existing IB theory, and sometimes you need to maybe come up with something totally new given the changes that are taking place. What are the areas that we need something totally new? Would anyone like to suggest some area that we really have opportunity for developing new theories?
I'm not sure what you mean by new theory, because when you do a review of all the empirical papers in the field of strategy and how companies are managed, you know, the explained correlation is minute. It's 10, 15%. So that means empirically the unexplained variance is huge, and we don't have the theories to fill in for this unexplained variance, right? Or maybe it is one of those things where companies are different from one another to such an extent that the kind of models that we have for explaining why companies choose their profits or their investments and so forth, and don't explain very much. When I did this, I gave that paper at the part of my Uppsala lectures, and eventually I decided that, you know, that maybe this is reality, that most companies really are not managed the way they were managed early on in their life. You know, so there's an Apple, but look at all the other companies that were in the space and disappeared. I had a company that installed mini computers so that small businesses could run their own business. Well, the mini computers didn't last long enough for this idea to even develop. They don't even have a life for 15 years.
Okay, thanks. That's surely insightful. So there's already a lot out there for us to maybe draw on, but we don't draw on it enough. Lorraine, you had a question, or rather a comment to add to this.
I just was going to try and respond to the same question. I've been thinking a bit about, okay, you know, in the late 80s and early 90s, I spent a lot of time talking about tariffs going down. You know, many of us did, right? And about regional integration and the pluses and minuses of regional groups and whether we were going global or going regional. I remember all those old debates. Can we just move in the reverse direction? Can we now talk about them going up? And is what we saw going down when the tariffs were going down and the barriers were going down simply going to be reversed in a way going up? And I don't think so. Let me give you two examples. The auto industry in North America is completely integrated as a result of, since 1965, all the way through in the auto industry. That industry is going to have a very different response to what's going on now than is the pharma industry, where something like some significant percent of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in generic drugs are made in China. And they're now going to have some incredible tariff rate on them. And so we're not going to be getting those APIs anymore. You better go out and stock up on your on some of your things. I talked to a Bayer executive the other day who's thinking about what is Bayer going to do as a result of this. The third one is that most young teenagers are hooked on Temu and Shine for buying goods. That was based on the de minimis tariff exemption that's now completely gone. It's completely disrupted the model of these e-commerce firms. So what I'm saying is, I think it's not as simple as saying what we did at the beginning of the 90s and thinking about tariffs going down and understanding what's happening. This is now 2025. You can't just reverse it. So I go back to something you said way at the beginning, Carl, when we started almost an hour and a half ago, which is in the question that you asked to Rosalie. There's been very little work on de-investment. Now, there has been some. Rosalie's done some. Arie has definitely done some on this, and I've done some on all this war zone stuff, which is about exit. But think about divestment. Are we going to have divestment and reconfiguration of value chains coming out of this? We are, yes. But remember, we're not talking manufacturing anymore. We think manufacturing. We're talking about services. We're talking about intellectual property rights. And we're going to be talking about digital. So we're going to see firms reconfiguring away from some forms of factors into digital factors, right? And then that gets you into talking not just to the industry 4.0, but now all the AI stuff that's coming at us with the ability to displace us. So if you ask me what I think the new theory's got to come from, the new theory's got to come from thinking about a world that is disengaging, where politics is more and national security are more important than they have ever been, where we at the same time have a technological shock that could perpetually displace us with firms. You may have seen this morning, PwC just announced it's laying off another 6% of its workforce. Where? They're laying off them in services that are going to be done by AI now. So the people are being let go. So my question in here is thinking, is there room for new IB theory? Absolutely. Do we need, as Arie said, more people in org theory? Absolutely. But I also think we need people in political scientists and national security. And I have the opportunity from time to time to talk to executives in transfer pricing now. They are beside themselves with thinking about short run and long run ways to handle what's going on. And it isn't just the tariffs going up, they're going up and down and up and down and up and down. It's the instability and uncertainty that I think is very, what I see multinationals doing is setting up headquarters now to study political risk inside the head office. There are now units specifically focused on geopolitical strategy, and a focus of that now is on trade policy when it never was before. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. I think we're needing to wrap up now. And so I'd like to ask each of you in just 30 seconds or so to say what is the one thing that you think everyone should keep in mind about how IB can deal with this sort of a new world. You've shared many things, but can we have one succinct comment from each of you? And let's perhaps start off with Alain.
Want to start with me?
Alain, if possible. Alain Verbeke.
Sure. Thank you very much, Carl. So my view is, I think, somewhat different from that of the other editors. I think that we do not need new theory at all in international business. I think that if people read what has been published in JIBS and related journals in the past 55 years, I think we have everything there that actually equips us to describe and explain international business empirical phenomena. So the phenomena are new, but we have very solid theory. And frankly, I'm always happy to learn from other fields. But to the extent that there is disrespect, it's actually disrespect from other fields towards international business, whereas we are the only ones, again, that study the largest type of business organization in the world. And to come back to what Arie says, most of them are bureaucracies. Well, sure, there is bureaucracy. There is often too much bureaucracy, but ultimately multinational firms are very well equipped to deal with a large number of disturbances, a large number of innovations, whether on the technological front or in terms of, for example, corporate social responsibility. And again, rather than criticizing MNEs or rather than saying that we need new theory, perhaps we should do a better job at applying existing theory and basically showing how we can, better than any other field, explain these phenomena, including, so-called digital globalization, including initiatives related to greening, for example, or to promote social justice. So I'm very much an optimist. And again, to conclude, I think that the theory of the multinational enterprise is the general theory of the firm. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alain. Rosalie, can we go to you next? Your thoughts on what IB should be thinking about now?
Okay. JIBS has always stated that it is a multidisciplinary journal. But by and large, I think if we look at the publications to date, primarily it's still written by people within the AIB community itself, or the IB community. I think the time is now really ripe for this kind of cross-fertilization, really drawing in people or researchers from other disciplines to help enrich our understanding of IB phenomena within the broader context of the new realities itself. But I also believe it is a time, okay, as Alain said, IB, or at least the journal, has not been that well respected in other areas as well. I think this is really the time when, through cross-fertilization, we can really contribute to theory developments in other fields as well. For instance, if we look at this whole issue of liability of origin, okay, I think this is the research that comes out from this, where we're looking at the country of origin of multinationals. I think it really can contribute to the literature on race and race relations that are prevalent in other journals. So this is just one example.
Thanks very much, Rosalie. Important for us to keep in mind the multidisciplinarity and all we can learn. Arie, let's go to you next. What do you think IB should be focusing on now?
If we think that we should really be allow China research into the journal more easily. I'd say we should offer a merger with Management Organization Review, combine the two into our system rather than let them live there in a closed world where they don't really get any outside feedback. The reason I'm saying that is because the main threat to the United States is the country called China. They live in a different way. They have long time horizons. We criticize them for they're not liberal democracies, but how can you explain how a country that has been around for 4,000 years, and now since 1978 under the Communist Party, could have achieved all of that was achieved in this time period? And I don't have time to talk about all of that. But there's much to be learned for why they can do that for themselves and why a lot of the things that they do cannot be done in the current liberal democratic model, okay? And lastly, we cannot be in this field any longer without bringing in geopolitical issues directly into our conversation. Not once in a while bring some speaker who's going to give us a talk in an academy meeting. And there's not an easy way to do that. I mean, I've tried to talk to people in political science at Duke and political scientists that I know who are on advisory committees for the federal government, and they tolerate me, but they don't really think about working with me. And
thanks very much, Arie. Insightful thoughts as always. Let's then go to Lorraine. Lorraine, what can you think we should focus on in terms of IB moving forward?
Okay, I'm going to go back to where I started from. I actually think we live in a VUCA world. There are huge global shocks going on, and studying events using event analysis is something we don't do a lot of. We focus on phenomena. I think focusing on shocks and how firms respond to shocks and different kinds of shocks and unpacking that model. So little of this appears in our IB journals now, and I think it's a very fruitful area for research. And I'll stop there. Thanks, and thank you very much to Carl for managing all of us.
Well, thanks very much. It's been a full time. Would really like to thank Arie and also Alain. And also Rosalie, and also let's see, I guess that's everyone. Yes, Lorraine, Arie, Alain, and Rosalie for excellent thoughts. A lot of great thoughts, hard to fit in as always in the time. It looks like we need to really think about multidisciplinarity moving forward, not to ignore the Chinese. Bring in politics, recognize the importance of shocks, and we can be comforted by what Alain had to say, that most of what we need is already present in IB theory. Still lots of food for thought. For some additional food for thought, May 19th at 9:30 to 11 East Coast time, you can attend the next Academy of International Business Journals webinar, which will be focusing on exploring the effects of nationalism, geopolitics, international trade, and tariffs. So some related themes to today, but going deeper with some empirical work into that. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us from all around the world, especially those of you who stayed up late, and hope we'll see many of you on May 19th. Thanks again for everyone for coming.